And this panel will be moderated by Marianna Reis. I've mispronounced that, Reis. She is a political organizer, socio-cultural anthropologist, and the current president of CUPE 3902, which represents over 10,000 contract academic workers at the University of Toronto.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as Pamela said, my name is Marianna Reis. I'm going to be the moderator today. I'll give a very quick remarks to frame today's discussion, and then I'll introduce our three panelists. So we sit here today just a few months after the United States military attack on Venezuela and the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro in the name of restoring law and order and bringing democracy. While Cuba remains under a brutal siege, I think it was just yesterday or the day before, Trump joked while speaking at in an investment forum in Miami. He was joking about US military intervention in Venezuela and Iran, and he said that Cuba is next. These are just two of the most recent examples of US imperialist aggression against Latin America and the Caribbean. So today's panel focuses on the historical and contemporary struggles against colonialism and imperialism in Latin America and the Caribbean, and invites us to articulate an internationalist front rooted in a long history of struggle against colonialism, slavery, imperialism, and racism. So I'm joined today by three excellent panelists who I'll now introduce. So first, I'll go in the order that they're seated. So we have Nelson Maldonado-Torres, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of Connecticut, and professor extraordinarius at the University of South Africa, and senior associate of the Black House Collective Soweto in South Africa. He's also co-chair of the Frantz Fanon Foundation and former president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association from 2008 to 2013. A specialist in decolonial thought, Maldonado-Torres has published extensively on decolonial ethics, political philosophy, the theory of religion, philosophical anthropology, and the philosophy of the human sciences. Next, we have Tamanisha John, who is an assistant professor at York University. She's a member of the Black Alliance for Peace, Caribbean Solidarity Network, and the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. Finally, we have Fernandez, who is a working immigrant and organizer with the Latin American and Caribbean Solidarity Network, the Venezuela Solidarity Coalition, and Latinx for Palestine. As an anti-imperialist activist in Toronto, he advocates for the causes of popular and revolutionary movements in Latin America and the Caribbean, and against so-called Canada's imperialist policies in the region. As a member of Latinx for Palestine, he promotes popular education on the little-known history of the violent neo-colonial role of Zionism in the region. He is a regular contributor to local Spanish-language community radio efforts, where he provides political commentary. He is currently the general coordinator of the Latin American and Caribbean Solidarity Network. So let's hear a round of applause for our panelists before we get started. So I'll get started with the first question. I've prepared 4 questions that are broad enough to allow each panelist to sort of speak to their specific expertise and experience. And then we can open it up to some questions from the audience at the end. So to start, and with reference back to the title of this panel, Resistance Movements in Latin America and the Caribbean, I'd like to ask each panelist to reflect on how Latin America and the Caribbean have been historically constructed and imagined as distinct or separate. How has that shaped the organization of resistance movements? And perhaps we can start with Nelson.
Hello. Happy to be here. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks for the organizers for the kind invitation. Very happy to be here, and I've been learning a lot in the last two days, and today. And well, to go to the question, I would say that I would start with saying that, of course, hegemonic maps, as we know of them, have been largely drawn by imperialist powers. And the names, most of the names used themselves carry some of the traits of that power, and they serve a purpose for empire purposes. And so the very notion of America, of course, is part of that story. The notion, the name America was first kind of put over the global map that included the area of South America, what is called now Brazil, as a different kind of continental mass, different from the then non-continental masses in Europe up to the 15th century. And so the name America comes from the person who realized after Columbus that actually there was a new territorial mass, and what they found was not simply an extension of Asia, right? So it was Amerigo Vespucci who came with that realization, and the map was drawn by a German cartographer, and he put America, and he put it on the area that is now kind of Brazil. Now, about 16 years ago, I think the Library of Congress of the US acquired that map, right? The map where the word America first shows up, signaling the space, right? And it's an extension of Europe, and it has a European name, right? And they exhibited. And it was very interesting to see the reactions of people who were coming through the Library of Congress to look at the map. Because some of them were saying, finally, how great that finally this map comes home. This is in the US, right? Finally, the map comes home. But how strange that it says America in the wrong place. That America is down there in the Southeast, not in what is now the United States. Nonetheless, we have them, it's ours, and it's here, it's home, so they thought. Now, the word America itself, highly ideological, carries extensive weight, from the European side. They see it as a way of naming, baptizing, integrating a new part, what for them was a new part of the world, into their own nomenclature. But then also for the US, they appropriate the notion, the name of the entire region to establish themselves as being in the maximum representative of the entire region, and the only one with whom Europe can establish a dialectical relationship. So when the US emerges in the 19th century, even the notion of the Monroe Doctrine at the beginning, first and foremost, was to let Europe know that the Americas, this other place is ours. We are your counterpart in this other part. So it's about the dialectic between the two continental masses. And so that's why many people in so-called Latin America, other parts of the Americas, resent that the United States, its founding project is built on that notion, that it is the authentic representative of the climax of humanity in these parts, and therefore it can enter into this relationship with Europe. Now, of course, in the last 10 years, with the increasing fascism in the US, we have seen another level of that, which is not only that the US is the best and legitimate representative of the best of humanity in this part so that they can enter a dialectical relationship with Europe, but it now sees itself as the savior of Western civilization. And so Marco Rubio the other day was lecturing Europeans, telling them we share a connection, and when we insist you, it's because we want to save you and the entire Western civilization. So in the 21st century, the US sees itself, and actually not simply in a dialectical relationship, but in really a position of hegemony over even Europe itself, right? Now, Latin America also has, the notion Latin America carries a similar ideological weight. In this case, it was an invention of the French powers. When the US became powerful and Anglo-Saxon America became very powerful, they wanted to divide, they wanted to help divide the potential natural connection between North Anglo-Saxon America and the southern part of America. So they invented the nomenclature to tell people in other parts that they have to give them their own concept. You are Latin America, which is different from that other America. Right? And it served the purposes of Europeans of divide and conquer. Of course, it also helps the people who were resisting US power because it allowed them to create a kind of a conglomeration. So yes, it serves to combat that US increasing imperial power, but at the same time, you know, it's like the ring in the Lord of the Rings. Give you something, but it comes with some traps and is connected to some other power, and that's part of what our movement struggle with. And to end, the Caribbean, I think, is a different thing, because the term the Caribbean actually is not coming so much from the Europeans. It refers to the indigenous populations in the region. And the Caribbean has been, in a way, kind of separate and different from the two Americas, the Anglo and Latin America, because it has this other aspect, the indigenous, that particular indigenous history. It also became the Caribbean, the place where transatlantic slavery started, and it has predominant parts are black dominant. So it has some particular, feature different from other parts of Latin America, also in common with some of them, but also it has a vast linguistic fragmentation in that zone. So there are specific struggles and ways of resistance in the Caribbean that are sometimes not understood at all by Latin Americans, right? By the idea of Latin America. And so this is part, and finally, that Caribbean happens to be the cradle where the modern colonial capitalist system was put together and globalized. So yesterday, when we were talking about different forms of imperialism, and the scholars, historians yesterday were talking about the last 500 years, the history of that new form of imperialism precisely was cultivated and then globalized, starting in the Caribbean. So I think that we have yet to pay attention to that importance of the region.
Thank you, Nelson. Tamanisha?
Hello? Okay. So I want to say thank you to the Unity and Forum team for inviting me here, and so that I will not be as sort of repetitive or say what was said. Something that's interesting to me, when Otis was speaking earlier, he talked about the fact that some people maybe thought Afro-American were separatists, and I was like, that seems so different for me, since in the Americas region, which is inclusive of the Caribbean, we refer to ourselves or know ourselves as belonging in the Americas. And so I'm thinking about how, when almost a decade ago now, my mom got US citizenship, and the lady told her congrats on being an American, and she was confused because she was like, I was always an American. I'm from the South American continent. But I think that it speaks to what was just identified as sort of US or the United States seeing itself as this hegemonic entity in the region. And I don't know why my mic is, echoing so much. Is it? Hello? Okay, yeah, maybe this is better. And so yes, the US wants to assert itself as this sort of hegemonic force in the region. And when we think about Latin America and the Caribbean region as distinct entities, what's really distinct about them is the sort of contours that colored their colonization by different European empires. So many people know that Latin America became sovereign much earlier, or at least received independence much earlier, but that independence was always a faulty or a fake independence, which sort of absconded the minimal responsibility that Spanish and the Portuguese empires had to people within those countries, so that it could purely extract resources from those countries. And so when we talk about sort of early independence, we're often talking about small dictatorships that were really set up by these empires to maintain control over people, because empire didn't want to spend that money, but they were still extracting the resources from there. And when we think about the Caribbean region, where enslavement and indentured servitude and then indentured laborer lasted much longer, a lot of that was because you needed enslaved Africans to reshape physical geographies in the Caribbean to do sort of the backbreaking labor required for sugar output. When they're free, you don't want to pay them, so now you bring in indentured servants from India and to a small extent China, so that they could carry out that work as servants, meaning that they didn't necessarily always get a wage. Sometimes it was that they lived on the plantation, carried over from the history of enslavement to justify that. And then even still, because of the dominant non-white populations in them, you brought in a lot of indentured laborers who would get a wage, and these laborers were typically Irish or the Portuguese, or just those Europeans that were already relegated to a working status in Europe, coming in to sort of establish hierarchies to maintain systems of white rule to some extent in a lot of these colonial spaces. And so in that sense, it is really the history of colonization and interaction with empires that make people different, even when sort of the whole tensions between Venezuela and Guyana occurred. A lot of people don't know this, but Guyana, the name comes from the Roro language, which is also a dominant indigenous group in Venezuela today. But the Americas region has always existed within these histories of indigenous migrations that get disrupted by the colonial event, and not necessarily these disconnected spaces where people are completely separated. In the Caribbean, language separation has been intentional precisely because they never wanted those people to communicate, given how easy and how historically people aided each other against different sort of imperial incursions onto those territories. And so even though we talk about, oh, how there's English, Spanish, French, and Dutch separation of languages in the Caribbean, for instance, those sort of separations are even more fragmented when we consider the fact that a lot of the English spoken is creolized, again, based on colonization. So Jamaican Creole, that's English, would have more sort of English influences, but Guyanese Creole, which is also English, we have Dutch, Hindi, and all of these other influences based on colonization. You also have the same with Spanish, so Dominican Republic, and the language that they speak is different from Cuba, is different from Puerto Rico, et cetera, et cetera. Same with French, Haiti, Dominica, all of these things, and then the Dutch Papamiento. All of these languages serve to keep these regions as separate, so we don't necessarily know what is going on in the other's island, and also the fact that migration by colonial empires were restricted to also maintain that segregation. I would say, you know, to sort of just fast forward a bit, one of the reasons why Venezuela has been a hair in the United States side for so long is precisely because it's encouraged more regional solidarity to decrease dependence on the United States, whether it's establishing free language schools throughout many Caribbean islands that a lot of people don't know about. A lot of people know about Petrocaribe and how it allowed different Caribbean countries to gain cheaper access to oil, or sometimes free access to oil, since our countries are energy dependent and lack energy. But outside of that, Venezuela's relationship to the Caribbean was really encouraged by Cuba, who has always referred to Caribbean countries as their brothers and sisters, given our histories of migration and sending aid to each other in times of imperialist incursions into our countries. And so, are these divisions real? I would say that the divisions are not real. The divisions are maintained to uphold US-led imperialist hegemony within the Americas region. Are they distinct? The distinctness comes again from these external interventions and incursions, which function directly to sever regional solidarities between countries. Anytime a Caribbean country has been intervened in historically by the European empires, or even today by the United States, one of the first things that they work to do is get rid of political, national, and regional institutions of solidarity between states. And that's why today you see fragmentation in CARICOM. And it's sort of this undermining because there is a concerted effort to keep peoples in the region separated so that they can be dominated by the United States. And people assume that this separation is simply because of language, but it's much deeper than that. It's due to direct interventions. And if it were only language, then we would not engage in sort of the free language translations or communications that we do. And we also would be completely in the dark about each other's countries. I think Maurice Bishop said it best when he said something that the United States feared about his revolution was the fact that he couldn't communicate to people in the United States in English. And the effect of that was to make sure that he was not heard in the United States in sort of English. There were efforts to block sort of any dialogue that he would have coming out from there. And if it weren't for academics from the United States going into Grenada to sort of reveal what is actually happening, we would have been in the dark about it by imperial design. And I'll just end there.
Thanks, Tamanisha. Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, I'm picking up, oh, that's loud. I'm picking up from a lot of cues here, which I appreciate too. I would like to talk about, for instance, the concept of difference, because it does exist. There is a difference between our regions and how we build our identities and so on. But that's different from hierarchies, for instance, right? And what brings hierarchy into the mix is precisely what we've been referring to, which is that first moment of European colonial expansion. And if we want to go into the longer run of history, and this is also really interesting because Pamela, which was introducing the panel, was also speaking as of how the elements of religion, for instance, play into these new tropes. Well, they're not new at all, matter of fact, but how they're resurging. And in that context, we can understand the expansion of the European, specifically, historically speaking, the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, through the notion of the reconquest type of thing, connecting it to the fact that the very same year that Columbus reaches the so-called discovers, quote unquote, the New World, which is 1492. That's also the same year of the fall of the Emirate of Granada in the southern Iberia, right? So there's actually some connections in the way we construct our idea about identity, this idea of Christianity being like an organizing principle. So all these things need to be challenged little by little. We need to understand our history, how this European expansion basically, even thinking of terms of the Caribbean as an original moment of let's call it a rival, for lack of a better word. But we're tracing it back to Islas Canarias, Canary Islands, off the coast of what is Spain nowadays. By the way, Spain didn't exist back in the days. Also in the middle of the Atlantic, which is Cape Verde too. It's like these are places where indigenous populations were wiped out and were eventually replaced for the purposes of extractive labor. That's where the transatlantic slave trade starts forming. And this is where the Caribbean comes into the fore, also because I would like to add to the idea that basically two key moments in the construction of the modern world system as we understand it, which I trace it back to over a little bit over 500 years old, and connecting to the conversation about what is a modern empire. We're not talking about what the Greeks did, what the Persians did, what the Romans did. We're talking about the organizing principles that structure society as it is. And that original division of humanity still holds up to this day. And it's that's the way in which the Americas as a continental space, especially when we think about its global south component, has been basically determined historically, right? But there's one other moment, which is obviously the Atlantic slave trade as a first moment of global European dominated trade and forms of commerce, if you want to call it like a global economy, like a first moment of globalization. But there's also the element of, in what we call the continental mass, also how indigenous labor was used to extract, for instance, minerals, specifically the case of gold and silver, and how that also reinforces that already beginning to emerge, that system. Now you have not only the connection between these two parts of the world, but you also have currencies that, that global trade system is being dominated by European expansionism ever since. All of this is definitely related to the way we understand ourselves as Americans. And I'm using the word Americans because I'm trying to reclaim the idea of our America, going back to what Tamanisha was saying too, because yeah, we can definitely go through this process in which we don't need to restrict the meanings of these words. Like if we think of an America constructed from the global north, then we can easily go into the example that Nelson was referring to critically when we look at Marco Rubio saying that, all this bunch of fascistic things that are just nothing else than naked 16th century colonialism, right? So yeah, that's where that hierarchy emerges. That's where we start organizing the world system as it is, and we have to recognize that we just keep on maintaining this. We keep on reinforcing them a lot of the times. There is this main, particularly in the continental mass of quote unquote Latin America, we tend to think inwardly about our history, and there's a lot of ignorance about different radical traditions. In the best case, we actually look at the indigenous rebellions. We look at how even they interact with the construction of modern nation states in a negative way in terms of they are negated, but they're there as forms of resistance. But we tend to largely ignore the radical traditions also that emerge in the Caribbean, and even how many times in history these two, let's call them two different traditions in terms of their historical composition, they actually work together and they collaborate. And this makes me think about the idea that the more we struggle together, the more we overcome these divergences, and the more we become subservient, the more that imperialism is able to dictate how we behave, how we relate to each other, especially as inhabitants of the global south. Then we're basically doing the opposite. We're just strengthening these artificial manufactured divisions. And I wanted to refer to a couple of examples of how that actually has happened historically. There's plenty of examples, but the experience of maroonage, like originally emerging in the Caribbean, but also extending into like this idea of what is the greater Caribbean. Like the Caribbean is not just a geographic limited space that it's insular, that refers specifically to the islands. It's a historical experience. It stretches from the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, what is the United States, that part of the United States, the states of like Florida or Georgia and so forth, also the coast of Mexico, all the way into northern Brazil, all the way actually into the other part of the Pacific. So the Caribbean spills into the Pacific, right? And thinking of this history, I guess I'll just finalize by telling you about something that you may be aware of. But in many instances, these traditions of fleeing enslavement, they resulted in the collaboration and the solidarity between indigenous peoples and formerly enslaved populations of African descent. You can look these examples up. Even in Cuba, for instance, now that we talk about Cuba as a modern nation state, this happened back in the days where an indigenous leader was his origin was from a Yucatan tribe, which is actually like a Mayan descent person that made it to the island. However he did it, I don't know. But he ended up leading a revolt against Spanish colonial rule and leading a maroon colony, if you want to call it a colony, right? So there's plenty of examples of how we have struggled together for the longest times. We just need to become more literate on what our shared history is.
Thanks, Aaron. So you've all already touched on the different lines and divisions and categories beyond sort of geography, thinking about and how they've shaped political life across the region. So the lines of race, class, gender, ethno-national identity, language, religion, citizenship, legal status, and so on. So how have these likewise shaped and been shaped by resistance movements, and who has been at the forefront of resistance to colonialism and imperialism? Nelson?
Yes, the terrain, the heterogeneity of the terrain is impressive. Even, we have talked about already, but you can add, for example, the legacy. This comes to the question of the legacies of resistance. For example, the legacy of maroon communities, quilombos, palenques. But then you also have the history of struggle within the sugar plantations. You have the struggles of also indigenous peoples in different latifundios, in different positions of serfhood. You have indentures, servants who came, and the legacy of struggles. And then you have also mestizo elites that were downgraded by the colonizers in the metropolis, and who also feel themselves kind of demoted from the level. And sometimes they articulate national projects from the perspective as mestizo elites, but completely ignoring the other forms of legacies of struggle that are even more profound, the ones that were born in the plantation and in maroon communities and so on. And so I wanted to share, there's also, I want to mention the fact that the Caribbean is also a direct zone of influence by the U.S., and we have a colony, direct colony of the U.S. in Puerto Rico. We have Cuba with a massive blockade. We have Venezuela with another blockade. You can think of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Venezuela, kind of a triangle that the US is using to try to take over possession of and control the entire region. But then you also see that France is in the middle of, has as a department status territories like Martinique, Guadeloupe, and so on and so forth. So the division is tremendous, but then also I think that now we have seen the legacy of the struggles. The notion of marronage has been taken out in the last 2 decades, right, as a kind of a common legacy of peoples resisting the coloniality of power through the entire hemisphere, and that is very central to the Caribbean experience. The question of black power and black resistance has been a unifying dimension throughout multiple areas of the Caribbean. Right now in Puerto Rico, I'm from Puerto Rico, and the transformation has been and is notable. How, for example, you saw that there was in the Hispanic Caribbean, but also other parts of the Caribbean, something that we grappled with is the demonization of Haiti, right? That everyone is supposed to be their future as escaping the position of Haiti or the conditions of Haiti. And so, but of course, in Haiti happened the slave revolution that was the first one after the US Revolution in the entire, and that was pivotal for the revolutions in Southern America because the political leaders actually supported and gave material support to Bolivar and other revolutionaries to advance those processes. And for some reason, that place where the legacy of that revolution is so central, we are all being told that we need to disconnect, right? And so now, however, in addition to the notion of marronage, the importance of Haiti has become another kind of motivating connector among a number of movements now that are looking to build a kind of a radical thinking that emanates from the trajectory and history of struggles in the region itself, right? So, and also, there has been very prominent the activities of feminist organizations throughout the Caribbean. In Puerto Rico, they has been key. One of the most important non-partisan political organizations is a feminist collective, Colectiva Feminista en Construcción, and they pride themselves in building their platform out of black feminist thought and decolonial thought. And they use the position being in Puerto Rico, where you are a colony of the US, so you have that connection to the north, but you also have Spanish, which is a connection to Cuba, which is also the connection to a lot of the south. Actually, they use their position in Puerto Rico as a bridge to connect radical legacies throughout. And because they are grounded on black feminism, they are also drawing from the black experience in the Caribbean. So the division is also, is not the entire story, because resistance has been, and combativity has been about creating linkages and rewiring the parts that have been disconnected to mobilize them in a combative direction.
Thank you, Nelson. Tamanisha?
So the first panel today was talking about the period of the 60s and 80s, and something that I want to mention is that since the 1940s up until the late 1980s, the United States was spending almost $700 million on its anti-communist strategy in the Caribbean, and with the sort of dissolution of the USSR, that decreased to about $50 million, because then it only needed to focus on gunboat diplomacy or direct interventions. And this has been something that I was trying to understand, because a lot of what was being targeted was ideology. And my sort of CSN comrade back there, Kevin, we were writing this piece on sort of the Caribbean people's debt to Cuba, and he noted that Caribbean people have a material interest in being anti-imperialist. And I think that that explains sort of why so much money was spent on beating down the ideologies of resistance in the Caribbean region as part of the US anti-communist strategy. In fact, the most amount of its anti-communist strategy funds went towards trying to influence Caribbean people to being more amenable or accepting to what they called the American or the United States way of life. And when you look at sort of Caribbean historiography, whether it's in the countries that are still territories or the countries that gained independence, you've had women, maroon communities, and indigenous communities always resisting and rebelling in some ways and revolting against European empires, especially as it related to labor. So I know, for instance, in Guyana, I'll reference that since my family's from there, as early as the 1917s, you had a lot of our labor organizations looking at what happened in Russia and sort of the Russian Revolution to say we need to replicate that here. And you have a lot of people who act so puzzled as to why Marxism, Leninism is so popular in the Caribbean region, but that's because a lot of our independence movements were of that orientation, which is why the British and the French and the Dutch had to engage in a whole bunch of constitutional trickeries and manipulations in order to sort of grant people their independence, sometimes putting social democrats in power because the other popular alternatives were just going to be the communists. And I mention this because it is also that history as to why, as early as the sort of 1917s, 1920s, you can have Black women like Gertrude Wood in Guyana leading a whole bunch of movements telling the labor union to include women and to also pay women a wage, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always been this sort of radical history in the Caribbean region in particular. And I think that's important to highlight because in the present, we see feminist or women's groups, LGBTQIA groups, some church groups, and also people organizing around questions of Haiti and Palestine. And people present these things as new, but they actually have a long historical presence in the Caribbean region. And so people are just pulling from sort of our historical archives to continue a lot of this work. So some of the feminist organizations in Latin America and the Caribbean region sometimes tend to be older and also had started off from much progressive first stances than a lot of the feminist organizations in Europe or even the predominant ones in places like the United States as well. And I think that that's important to highlight. Also, going back to this sort of question about language, a lot of people don't know that a lot of the French and Dutch territories in the Caribbean over the past decade, I think for Dutch territories, 2 decades, people have, like Puerto Rico as well, been fighting for independence. They have signs saying, kick the Dutch settlers out. And you'll see those signs be featured in sort of AP articles in the US, but since people can't speak the language, they don't know that the sign is saying, kick the Dutch settlers out. These are presented as regular protest, right? And I think that this is very important because 3 years ago, people were shocked that France sent a large contingent of French police from France to go and squash protests in Martinique. And then they tried to paint the protesters as being anti-COVID lockdown, even though the protests had began prior to COVID, where people were protesting against their wages and inability to access food. Because the Dutch and the French, what they do is they use their territories in the Caribbean in the present to offset inflation in their own countries, meaning that the people in those territories end up having to pay the higher prices to continue to subsidize the people on the mainland, and are told, if you don't like this inflation, migrate to the mainland, but then you legally and technically cede your right to the land, right? And I think that this is very important because we see sort of the similar dynamics playing out in Haiti, wherein they have not had elections for 2 decades because Canada, the United States, France, and all of these other countries believe that every time Haitians are given the opportunity to elect a president, that president is going to be social democrat, and per the constitution in Haiti, they must increase the minimum wage. Countries like Canada and the United States that want to use Haiti as a low-wage manufacturing hub in the Americas have a fundamental problem with the minimum wage in Haiti even increasing a little bit. So even when we talk about sort of gang violence that's concentrated in Port-au-Prince, a lot of it is due to dispossession because of US and Canadian mining companies in Haiti trying to force people into Port-au-Prince to act as surplus labor to keep manufacturing wages down in the capital. And a lot of the people harmed by that do tend to be children, women, and men. And also because Haiti has been intervened in this way for so long, some of the most innovative or forward-thinking analysis on how to combat neoliberalism and how to create organizations to combat them actually comes from Haiti. But again, due to language barriers, many people don't know that. And so I would just say that history and organization against imperialist resistance is quite strong in the Caribbean region, even if people aren't speaking all of the languages to pick that up. But a lot of today's organizations that are currently being highlighted, given US direct transgressions against the region, have long histories of organizing against authoritarian democracies, which exist throughout the Caribbean, precisely because these states are engaged in imperialist service to aid the US in the kidnapping in Venezuela, and even now to sort of overthrow Cuba. I guess as one last thing I'll say, because I've been talking for quite long now, but US-led Western imperialism is the primary contradiction in our system today. And there are always secondary contradictions. Those secondary contradictions would be what people pick at when they look at what the internal situation or the domestic situation in any state or country looks like. As Marxists and as Leninists, our first position is to look at that primary contradiction of US-led imperialism, and the secondary contradiction only becomes important to us when and if it is upholding or uplifting US-led imperialism. And so this is why we would say we need to look at the state and the structure of Caribbean societies that are aligning in US invasions in Venezuela or aligning with US wants for regime change versus saying, oh, we may not like the monarchical, whatever they say, system in Iran, because that system is not aiding US imperialism to murder people around the globe globally. And I think that it is up to us to continue class and materialist analysis to be able to make those distinctions, because otherwise you have people who are misinformed about what the real contradictions are and end up aiding US-led imperialism, including the invasion and kidnapping of Venezuela as just getting Maduro, ignoring the fact that over 100 people died, over 100 people were injured, and that places, physical entities in Venezuela were bombed, and why you could have an island with millions and millions of people, over 10 million people, currently being deprived of energy, when many of us would be upset if we were not able to charge our phones for 20 minutes. And I think that that's important to highlight.
Thank you, Tamanisha. Aaron?
Yeah, I think that actually another manifestation of imperialism, which encompasses its material forms, is the concept of whiteness. And in that regard, that is precisely it invites us to think about the relationship between popular movements, between indigenous movements, and also the type of nation states that exist in at least in our region, right? And but I'm saying it doesn't come from an anarchist position at all. I'm sorry if that sounds anything like that. It's not, because I tend to use the example, for instance, of the Haitian Revolution, which actually, in my understanding, emerges from, once again, the experience of maroonage, and then that actually develops into a project to build a state, to build a nation. Historical contradictions emerge once again because of imperialism and colonialism, particularly at that point in time. But I'm just bringing this up because it refers back to this concept that is normally used. It is spoken as the subaltern, the idea of the people that are in a different zone, in a marginal zone, or as maybe as Frantz Fanon referred to multiple of them, as the wretched of the earth, or people that are in the zone of like a negative zone of existence, or the zone of no being. And indeed, we have to recognize that these contradictions exist in the Caribbean, in so-called Latin America, when it comes to how we relate to our states. So those contradictions will always exist. The processes of independence, of the formal independences that might have taken place 100 years before the 20th century, for instance, in the case of, you call it Mexico, you call it Colombia, you call it Venezuela, or whatever. They were ultimately Creole-led nations, and they were looking at a particular form of organizing themselves, looking at Europe, for instance. Nevertheless, all those independence movements are intersected by a multiplicity of struggles from the ground, from indigenous peoples. I can specifically talk of the case of you may be able to relate to the Mexican independence as one of these many state projects where it becomes an empire, and there's forms of despotism and all these different words that we use. But that's the reason why a revolution emerges, and that revolution has a component that is of a communal nature, that is of a peasant-led nature. And this is the elements that we have to definitely keep track on when we talk about, even to relate them to like the national liberation movements in other parts of the world that emerged, probably after the Second World War, mostly speaking, that this is the struggle that we're continuously in. It's the process of nation building is not a process of removing ourselves from that space. Politics belong to everyone. Radical politics become to the people in the struggle, and that's what I wanted to call out to the concept of whiteness, because as another manifestation of imperialism, it calls us not to act. I would even superpose like a radical antagonism between the idea of how we're meant to behave, how are we meant to organize our societies, how are we meant to practice our economies, and the Haitian Revolution. This is a pivotal breaking point in history, right? And we have many other examples that attempt to do that. History has changed, conditions have changed. The very same reason why Cuba becomes also an articulating point to connect the greater Caribbean and to relate to the rest of quote-unquote Latin America. The same thing in the case of like what Venezuela has been trying to do for the last 25 years. And even beyond whatever internal contradiction may emerge, there is that seed, that potential is still there. So it's our job as internationalists, but even as people in the region, to look at the long run of history, look at how these different communities are also taking, like basically practicing agency. I'm talking about real agency, not agency vis-a-vis interventionism, not agency, political agency on the ground. There's different projects that come along with long-rooted traditions. I just want to give a shout out to like the communal projects in Venezuela, for instance. And in current, like nowadays, when we try to assess what's happening in Venezuela, of course, there's a whole bunch of things happening right now, and we cannot make an immediate assessment. We have to be critical too, but I think that a point that we have to look at is what's happening in the ground. Not to separate it from the state, because even the whole communal process in Venezuela, it was not just like clear-cut or transparent in terms of how it relates to the state, but it's still there, and that's a measure that we can take. And I think this is gonna take me to like elaborating more on how what we call minorities, which in the case are actually not the case. Like when we talk about, I mean, they're minorities numerically speaking, but the legacy, the potential, and the potence that they have in different communities and in different nations, like national identities, it's still there. Like the indigenous element of organizing of communal economies. This has actually transcended into forms of like political processes, like this is the case of Bolivia, for instance. Once again, everything is a struggle. We take some steps back, there's some steps back, but we cannot just look at every time that imperialism strikes back, then we just go back into our trenches. Like we need to actually come out and continue the struggle. Otherwise, in this moment of like conjunctural crisis, and I think it's important to revisit what we have seen out in the news, because now it's just fully open for us to see. As Tamanisha was saying, it's not only for the communities in the Caribbean. Like anti-imperialism is a material necessity, just to be able to maintain the basic necessities, the basic conditions of reproduction of life in the planet, in the region. We must appeal to organizing and to always keep in mind that the main contradiction is indeed imperialism.
Thank you, Aaron. I think we have to wrap up very shortly, but I'm going to do one quick final pass with my final question, or two that I'm combining into one. So we're in a particularly escalated moment of imperialist aggression against Latin America and the Caribbean, and elsewhere, of course, to foment regime change and plunder resources. Of course, that's being laundered through the language of freedom and security. At the same time, the terrain of global solidarity is confused and unable to unite around a clear anti-imperialist politics. So what are some key lessons about principled anti-imperialist resistance that people in this room can take back to their organizing here in Toronto?
Well, I already mentioned the works such as La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción, very consciously taking on and making the connections with the North. Yes, actually, this is one of their, a mural in Puerto Rico which they painted, and is de las ruinas nacerán miles de semillas, y será libre Puerto Rico y Palestina. From the ruins, thousands of seeds will emerge, and Puerto Rico and Palestine will be free. And they are very consciously, in a way, they are building from two different routes of movements for emancipation that have existed in the region for a long time, but also the routes that the empire itself has created, using sometimes those routes against the interests of the empire itself. We're talking about trafficking and mobilizing knowledges from different parts of the Americas in an anti-imperial, anti-colonial function. And then another example that I wanted to mention is an organization also in Loíza. This is a prominently black organization in the town of Loíza, and Loíza is perhaps the most recognized black Puerto Rican town in the archipelago of Puerto Rico. And they developed a number of years ago a project that they call building a cultural bridge from Piñones. Piñones is the specific place in Loíza where they live, building a cultural bridge from Piñones to Africa, right? And so they're in a way bypassing the whole question about relation with the US, including in this case, recognizing the importance, but also going beyond the question of relating Caribbean and Latin America and building on a solid, strong Pan-Africanism that has existed in the Caribbean, in the US, but also in Africa. And so one of the activities, the most recent activities that they did is that, and I joined them, and we were in Soweto, South Africa, and they came, even though there are the linguistic differences, the Pan-African connection was established through music, and particularly the use of the drum. And one of the visitors actually is a drummer and musical director of a bomba. Bomba is a genre of Afro-Puerto Rican music. And he came, he brought his drum, and bringing the drum to the also Soweto, also we went to Durban and Cape Town, was in a way of calling. Many of the actual people in the discussion, community organizers and so on, all the previous meetings that we have had are meetings like this. Once the drum came, it changed the entire dynamics of the conversation. Even though the gap between Spanish and English existed, they're coming from a Spanish language background. And so when we came the next year, most of the activities that were organized in South Africa had the drum. So much that they call one of them drumming up the revolution. But already that is a result of a Piñones, Sowetan, South African connection. And this kind of activities and connections are taking place every day in multiple forms, but these organizations are building on this platform that exists and building new bridges and connections. And I think that, in a way, it is very fragmented, the terrain today, and we live under a very virulent new imperialism and fascism. But at the same time, we have all these sources and treasures of combative decolonial thinking, and more we're making connections between them. And I think that that's one of the exciting things about fighting the fight today.
Tamanisha?
So I think that something that we need to really take seriously as it regards this question of unity, solidarity, and organizing in an imperialist, settler, colonialist state like Canada or like the US, is that people need to have ideological clarity, as David Austin said earlier, but also people need to be disciplined and principled in their organizing and also learning. People have to, within themselves and in their organizations, guard themselves against imperialist propaganda and imperialist analysis, which works to not make unity possible. This is what builds the stereotypes that we have against each other. That and some people in their organizations allowing people that are not disciplined or don't have discipline into them, where they will allow transgressions to occur against the people that they have to organize with. Today, Ricky Atkinson up here, he said that armed revolution is not happening in Canada. Or I would also say in the imperial core, the United States, Canada, et cetera, since it is the reactionaries and the counter-revolutionaries that have the majority of the arms. And so if a war were to break out, we would be outgunned quite literally by the state and those with the arms. And so this is where our support for resistance against US-led imperialism in the global south becomes very important. You don't need to condemn resistance to imperialism. That is feeding into the imperialist propaganda that allows resistance movements to be crushed. Instead, our task in the imperial core countries or in the imperialist countries that frequently align with the US is to provide resistance forces with the intellectual and ideological support and cover to craft a norm around the fact that we reject imperialism. When we are not doing that, we allow resistance movements to not only be crushed, but we make our task here within the core much harder because we erase the sort of rights narrative afforded to us within these liberal regimes to change the discourse around what resistance can look like and should look like. And so our task is intellectual and ideological, since none of you are going to pick up a gun or expect to be shot outside fighting for a revolution here. And in that same vein, you should not then encourage people to just be steamrolled by imperialist forces abroad. So to put it out plainly, ideological clarity, discipline, and principled organization.
Thank you, Tamanisha. Aaron?
I think that that the struggle locally and even domestically is precisely how do we stop recreating all these transnational dynamics, especially what we've been talking about today? How do we transcend that even on a more immediate and local space? That's something that I hope, for instance, like conversations like this, the forum overall, are helping to bridge. It's a long conversation. We need to also acknowledge that there are material realities that we need to basically struggle to transform. And there's also hierarchies that we have assumed. So even having those conversations is going to be part of it. We don't need to shy away, but we need to have clarity indeed. I'm thinking that when we think about the region of the Greater Caribbean, what I tried to describe before, and I think it's definitely come across, it's been quite clearer and clearer as we spoke today, is basically transcending this idea of homogeneity, which happens a lot in quote-unquote Latin America. You know, this identity of predominantly mestizos or like mixed race subjects, predominantly Catholic, Spanish-speaking as the rule. And although historically and materially that's a reality, we need to realize that that's not the whole thing. And matter of fact, this is one of the things that we need to subvert. Like, these are the tools that we have. Ultimately, language is actually a powerful tool. So it's not just only a colonial tool. We have this potence in the Spanish-speaking Latin America, for instance, to start transcending these things. But we need to look out. We need to look outwards and really see that the whole region as a whole is rich in experiences. We cannot isolate ourselves, especially because that's what imperialism as a whole. It seems nowadays that the Caribbean region as a geographical place, it's strongly more colonially organized than other regions in the world, and that is precisely because how it is a pocket of resistance. We've spoken about that in the historical sense, but even in a current sense, therefore we spoke about Cuba and we talk about Venezuela. So keeping that in mind is ultimately important, so that we don't miss like the compass. You know, when we talk about international solidarity, when we go back to Palestine, for instance, that has sparked a conversation to us of pivotal moments or spaces such as, you know, I'm thinking of Palestine, Gaza specifically, and Cuba goes also in that bag when we think about how it has transcended the borders, how it has reached out to all these other communities. You may be aware, for instance, or not, that the fact that the Palestinian resistance back in the 60s and 70s were, in the 70s mostly, were pivotal for the Sandinista revolution to win key battles, for instance. These are things that they may not be of common knowledge, but that's the case. And in the case of Cuba, well, we cannot we cannot pay back like what Cuba has done for the rest of the world, and internationalism as such is something that we have to bring into our communities. We have to bring that spirit into our organizing. And I guess that sort of trying to wrap up, we indeed need to think about the concept of decolonizing, decoloniality, but also in a radical way, because the coloniality that I refer to it includes anti-colonialism. This is a longer conversation about where they intersect, how are they different, but I think that like radical, popular led decoloniality includes anti-colonialism, so I don't treat them as specifically different concepts. There's some semantics that have to be dealt with. And then that brings us into their anti-imperialist condition, their anti-imperialist potence. So part of the work that we have to do, if you are in a specific place like in academia, or if you are in spaces where intellectual work is privileged, then we need to project, we need to reclaim these things. It's easy for all these categories to, anti-imperialism, it's a really clear-cut category. But I think that when it comes to decoloniality, it's everyone's working towards actual decolonization, to keep on reclaiming it, to keep on building it from the ground up, and not to allow it to be co-opted, right? And just lastly, the role of Canada, not only in the region, but even how whiteness, the concept of whiteness tends to keep us divided, because there's certain patterns that have to be replicated, certain modes of being that are privileged and are accepted, and we just need to become more literate, educated on the role that Canada has played all over the region. Maybe just to wrap it up, because this is a whole bunch of connections, like once again, going back to Haiti. Well, I don't know if you guys probably you guys know this, but the first leader that was kidnapped in the Caribbean was not Hugo Chavez, my bad, Maduro, was not even Bernard Aristide, was actually Toussaint Louverture. After the Haitian Revolution, when the French came and invaded Haiti once again, he was basically tricked into going and meet with the French forces, and basically he was kidnapped back into France and eventually died in prison. So knowing our history, knowing the history of colonialism, and actually seeing reflected in things that are happening nowadays, it's really important. And I went into France. I actually wanted to talk about Canada, but Canada is also a cog of the machine of the colonization and neo-colonization and imperialism in Haiti. Canada was a key part in the kidnapping of Bernard Aristide. Canadian Armed Forces secured the airport from which he was extracted to eventually, I believe, the Central African Republic. And lastly, it was Hugo Chavez that wanted to offer him to come to Venezuela during that moment. Unfortunately, that didn't happen because of some mishaps with phone conversations. But anyways, this is just to connect everything to Latin America, colonialism, and what we struggle for, which is anti-imperialism and decolonization.
Thank you, Aaron. This has been a really great conversation, and I'm grateful to have been able to moderate this panel. I just want to thank our panelists, Nelson Maldonado-Torres, Tamanisha John, and Aaron Fernandez one more time, so let's give it up. And thanks to the Unity and Struggle Forum for organizing this panel today. Thanks, everyone.